Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic that's been making a lot of headlines. I mean, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
The idea of mass deportation of undocumented immigrants in the U.S. We're talking about potentially 11 million people.
11 million.
It's a huge number, like almost impossible to even grasp.
Right.
So in this deep dive, we're going to break it all down. We'll look at the history, the legal side, the economic realities, and most importantly,
The human impact.
exactly. And to help us navigate all of this, and we're also drawing on research from some heavy hitters, the Pew Research Center, the American Action Forum, and the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy.
We're talking serious research.
So just to kick things off, what are some of the initial thoughts that come to mind for you when you hear this idea of mass deportation?
Well, the first thing that strikes me is that this isn't a new debate. Oh yeah, I mean, history often repeats itself, and there's a pretty stark parallel that jumps out right away. The Mexican repatriation.
That happened back in the 1930s, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Between 1929 and 1936, an estimated 2 million people of Mexican descent were deported.
2 million, wow.
And get this, a significant portion of them, like 60%, were actually U.S. citizens.
Wait, U.S. citizens were deported? How is that even possible?
It's a prime example of how these types of policies can go wrong, They start with good intentions, maybe,
Right.
but they can quickly turn into tools of discrimination, targeting entire communities based on ethnicity rather than actual legal status.
It's not just about who's here legally or illegally. It becomes about something much bigger and much more dangerous.
Exactly. And that's a really chilling reminder of what can happen when fear and prejudice drive policy decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a crucial point to keep in mind as we delve deeper into this current debate. So let's talk about the sheer scale of what we're talking about here. 11 million people. That's like emptying out entire cities, right?
Absolutely. It's hard to even wrap your head around it.
We're talking the populations of Chicago and Los Angeles combined.
That's a massive undertaking.
And logistically speaking...
Don't even get me started on the logistics. I mean, think about it. Trying to identify and process 11 million individuals legally.
Right.
Potentially holding court hearings for millions of people.
I mean, where would we even detain that many people?
Exactly. And then there's the transportation, coordinating with other countries to receive these deportees.
It all just seems completely overwhelming.
It's a logistical nightmare.
And then there's the financial side of things.
Oh, the cost would be astronomical.
I remember seeing some figures that were just mind-blowing.
The American Action Forum estimated it would cost somewhere between $400 and $600 billion.
And that's just a low-end estimate.
It's hard to even fathom that amount of money.
So where would that money even go?
Well, you're talking about $10,000 to $20,000 per person just for processing and transportation.
Just to get them out of the country.
Exactly. And then you've got to factor in the costs of detention centers, legal battles, coordinating with other countries. The list goes on and on.
It's a financial black hole.
It really is.
And it makes you wonder, couldn't that money be used in more effective ways? Like investing in programs that address the root causes of immigration or strengthen border security in a more humane and sustainable way.
Yeah. It definitely raises a lot of questions about resource allocation.
But we're going to dive into alternative solutions later on. For now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the economic impact of something like this. Because undocumented immigrants, they're a part of our workforce, right? They contribute to our economy.
Absolutely, and they contribute a significant amount.
I remember reading about that.
The Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy found that undocumented immigrants contribute $11.6 billion in state and local taxes every year.
So removing them from the workforce, I mean, that would have huge implications.
Oh, absolutely. We'd be looking at potential labor shortages in key industries.
Like agriculture.
Agriculture, construction, hospitality.
Right.
Those industries rely heavily on immigrant labor.
And if those jobs aren't filled,
you're likely going to see prices go up for consumers.
So it affects everyone.
And there's even a chance it could impact the overall U.S. GDP.
It's like domino effect.
Exactly.
And it makes you realize that this isn't just about immigration.
No.
It's about the economy. It's about jobs. It's about, the price of goods and services.
It touches every aspect of our lives.
And, this whole discussion about using resources, it brings up another question for me. Could the military even be involved in something like this?
Yeah.
A mass deportation effort?
That's a good question, and it gets into some pretty tricky legal territory.
Okay.
There's a law called the Posse Comitatus Act.
I've heard of that, but I don't really know what it is.
Oh, it was passed back in 1878, and it basically prohibits using the military for domestic law enforcement.
So even if the government wanted to use the military for deportations,
They'd potentially run into this legal roadblock unless Congress specifically authorizes it.
interesting. So it's not as simple as just giving the order. There are all these legal considerations as well.
There are a lot of legal hurdles to consider.
And then you've got the whole issue of sanctuary cities.
Right.
I mean, those cities have policies that specifically limit cooperation with federal immigration enforcement.
Exactly. They've made a conscious decision to protect their undocumented residents.
So how would that play out in a mass deportation scenario?
You could potentially have this patchwork of enforcement across the country, with some areas resisting the federal government's efforts.
So even more legal battles.
Potentially. It adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation.
Absolutely. And, as we're talking about all this, I think it's really important to remember that we're not just talking about numbers here.
We're talking about people's lives.
We're talking about families. We're talking about communities that would be torn apart.
The human cost is immeasurable.
And that's a really crucial point that I think sometimes gets lost in the political rhetoric.
It's easy to get caught up in the numbers and the arguments, but we can't forget that there are real human beings at the center of this.
So let's talk about that human cost. I mean, I know we mentioned earlier that many undocumented immigrants have U.S.-born children.
Right. Children who are American citizens by birthright?
So we're potentially talking about separating families, parents from their children.
The Pew Research Center estimates that 16.7 million people live in families where some members are citizens and others are undocumented.
That's a huge number.
It is. And it highlights the potential for widespread family separation and the devastating impact it would have on children and communities.
And that impact is not just emotional, right?
There's a lot of research that shows the long-term negative effects of family separation.
On mental health.
Mental health, education, social cohesion.
It's a truly heart-wrenching scenario.
It is. And it raises some serious ethical questions about the morality of such policy.
Because even beyond the psychological impact, there's the moral question of whether it's right to uproot people who have built lives here who contribute to our society.
Exactly. Many of these individuals have been living in the U.S. for years, working, paying taxes, raising families. They're integral members of their communities.
And deporting them would not only be incredibly disruptive, but could be seen as a deep injustice, especially when you consider how complicated our immigration system is.
Right. And the lack of a clear path to legalization for so many.
It really makes you think about what it means to be American, doesn't it?
It does.
Is it just about following the letter of the law? Or is it also about compassion, about fairness, about giving people a chance?
It's a question that goes to the heart of this debate and forces us to confront our values as a nation.
It's a big question.
It is.
And, I keep thinking about everything we've discussed so far. The historical parallels, the logistical hurdles, the financial burden, the potential for discrimination, the economic impact, the legal challenges, and now the human cost.
That's a lot to consider.
It is. So before we move on, I have to ask, is mass deportation even feasible? Is it even remotely realistic?
Honestly, when you take into account all the factors we've just discussed, it seems incredibly difficult to pull off.
Almost impossible.
Maybe even impossible.
It just raises so many questions.
It does.
Like, if mass deportation isn't the answer, then what is? What other approaches could we explore to address the complexities of immigration in a more humane and sustainable way?
Yeah.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
And thankfully, it's a question we're going to be tackling in the next part of our deep dive.
This is part 1 of a 2-part series. Thank you for joining in to the Thinking Out Loud podcast show. We invite you to the next podcast, The Deportation Dilemma, Part 2, Mass Deportation of Undocumented Immigrants. Remember to like, share, and subscribe.